Hello, hello, my lovely seekers and finders. Welcome to this very special episode. Today we have a very special guest. His name is Daniel Ingram. Most of you probably know who he is. So Daniel is a rather well-known figure in contemporary spirituality. He is the author of Mastering the Core Teachings of the Buddha. He is also a chair board of a nonprofit called Emergent Benefactors, and also a member of EPRC, I think. That's called Emergent Phenomenology Research Consortium. He also created the website Dharma Underground and integrated Daniel. So he's quite well known, and I'm very, very grateful for him to him for this opportunity to have a conversation with him. So please, I also wanted to add, but I will add Daniel now. So I also want to hi Daniel.
Hello.
Hi, hi. I also wanted to add for my students that Daniel and I had a couple of conversations before, and he's certainly to me he is one of the most open-minded, down-to-earth, and pleasant people to speak to. So thank you, Daniel, for coming. Thank you very much. I appreciate it.
Oh, it's very kind of you. Thank you so much. I enjoy being here. I should say, with regard to the Dharma Overground, it was co-founded by Vince Horn and myself to give credit where credit is due. So,
Oh,
yeah,
yes, thank you.
you're
And by the
welcome.
way, also I mentioned that you are a member of EPRC, but you're probably a founding member also, right?
I'm one of the early members of the EPRC, and at the moment, find myself with no official title, but you could call me one of the main administrators of it. So
Okay.
everybody else had like lives and jobs and kids and stuff, and I was retired with some time, so I ended up sort of the de facto administrator, helping to build it. But yeah, I get a lot of help from a lot of people, so very grateful
But
for
you've
that
done
as
a
well.
lot, and you continue to do a lot. So you have my utmost respect, my
Hmm.
friend. Thank you.
So what are we going to be chatting about today?
Oh, I have many topics. So I have some questions from students, which we'll get to. The topics that I can offer you. So one topic that comes up again and again and again is how to navigate the spiritual landscape, because the spiritual landscape, as I'm sure you know, can be a labyrinth, and there are many people claiming all sorts of things, and many teachers saying all sorts of things. So a lot of my students have this question: well, how do you even begin to discern who knows what he's talking about, and who doesn't, and who can be a good teacher, and who we shouldn't listen to, or there's any sort of, well, we can say test, but like any sort of science that helps you discern whether to work with someone.
It's a very important question and
Yeah.
not an easy answer, but we'll get there.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah, well, so we would love to hear your thoughts on that.
Well, the first thing, this was actually the last question the Buddha asked before he died. And this guy came up and they were like, I want to ask the question to the Buddha. They're like, no, no, no. And the Buddha was like, yeah, actually, you can ask me a question. And he said, how can we tell? How can we tell who
Yeah.
the realizers are? How can we tell who are the people with real knowledge? And the answer was essentially trust in the Sangha and trust in your own practice. And it was not particularly satisfying, I must say. Like, of the Buddha's answers, wasn't one of the ones that was really all that satisfying. And we find ourselves faced with the same question today. So, how do we know? The first, you asked, there was another thing. There actually, I've met people who didn't really know things who could actually teach them well, and people get value out of them. So this is another funny thing. There are people who don't maybe necessarily have that strong practice who yet, when they teach various practices that are known to do useful things, people who follow them actually get some cool results. So the techniques themselves, simple things about investigating your reality and experience done in reasonable doses, themselves can be effective. I myself found that for most of my meditative path, I was doing incredibly simple, time tested things that have been around for thousands of years, just in really high doses. And it was more the dose necessarily than the teacher or anything else. And the simple, things where you're learning basic skills of how to pay attention, how to understand, how to investigate, how to settle in, how to develop various positive factors or qualities of mind or behavior or speech or thought or whatever it was. And so, did I need super fancy teachers to teach me super basic things that were open tech, that were freely available? That I don't know, maybe not. In all
I
honesty,
agree.
so that sort of be a light unto yourselves. The simple practices that have been around for thousands of years that keep working are likely to work for you as anything. So that's also important. And then then the next thing is I know people who I really consider relatively not good people. Like I don't I do the opposite of respecting them, and yet there are people who study with them who do great. They do great, and so it's also true that you can get real benefit out of teachers that are obviously somewhat psychopathic or narcissistic or exploitative. That also can, strangely enough, occur. And I even have a few friends who intentionally um, seek out teachers who are like edgy and sort of controversial and whatever because something in that kind of works for them. So that's another sort of a problem. Just to be fair in all this and realize the landscape is very complicated.
Yes.
Um, and then we all have our own aesthetics and things that we like. I like teachers that keep the money really clean. Although I have a reasonable number of friends who charge relatively high prices to teach meditation, and their students do fine and seem fine with the exchange. So even is that aesthetic necessarily that helpful? Maybe not. I like it, but that doesn't mean anybody else has to, and it might actually impede some people getting some of the help they need. I don't know. What are your thoughts? I'm just throwing out some things that just sort of highlight the degree to which this is not simple.
I think this is a great thought. Yeah, I think that you touched upon the most important things. And first of all, yes, there is some sort of uncanny similarity sometimes between narcissism and psychopathy and enlightenment.
Mm-hmm.
And I actually go into the similarities in one of my answers because a lot of people ask, like, was Osho a psychopath or a sociopath or a narcissist? I mean, in my opinion, neither. And it can be sometimes quite uncomfortable and painful even to interact with a highly realized person. And actually, the spirituality is full of stories of how this pain can be helpful. For example, I'm remembering, if I remember correctly, it was Muji. Oh no, it wasn't. It was Yuji. So Yuji asked his guru, "What about this enlightenment thing? Can you give it to me?" And he said, "I can give it to you, but can you take it?" And this apparently was extraordinarily offensive to Yuji. So he experienced a lot of hurt pride and someone could say it's a pretty narcissistic response. So there's certainly value on both sides. I think that what with regards to experiencing discomfort and pain when you're working with a teacher, the separation between mature teachers and immature teachers is whether they, first of all, delight in hurting you, right? Mature teachers don't delight in hurting you. They're just being honest, sincere, open. And how skillfully, like, for example, this question was very skillful because if I remember correctly, the story, that's the question that sort of sparked, or it was, or like served as a sort of served some sort of a cathartic function in Yuji's realization, if I remember the story correctly, and whether they sort of are very insistent on like touching you in the way that you don't want to be touched, because mature teachers, in my perspective, even though they can still kind of surgically touch your pain, they aren't insistent on it. They don't derive their own pleasure from it, and they don't need it, right? Immature teachers, they sort of need it. They really want you to make the realization, so they oftentimes like push you in a way that feels abusive. So I think, but I think that the what you touched upon, the reason why such teachers can be effective is precisely that, because basically, from my perspective, the whole of the spiritual path is making unconscious suffering of the ego conscious, and so kind of touching some points of confusion or insecurities can be very effective on the path. But this is just a question of its appropriateness. When it's done, is there a connection? Is there some maturation of awareness? Is the person ready for it? So all of this has to be taken into account. And I also wanted to say something else. Oh yes, like you said so aptly, that it's all about being a light into yourself, and that's absolutely right. So the thing that I repeat to my students again and again and again is that the only measure, from my perspective, of a good teacher is how frequently and efficiently he or she can help you see something about yourself, acknowledge something about yourself, whether experientially or intellectually, be it a part of your experience on the level of insight, on the level of logic. Acknowledge, recognize something about yourself that you were previously in denial of before, that you previously did not acknowledge before. And that's the only measure of a good teacher. So it could be in the direction of bliss, into the direction of love, or it could be uncomfortable. It could uncover some of the arrogance of vanity, but it's still kind of, if you're working with a good teacher, then your self-knowledge, your self-acceptance, your level of your deepening into your own experience must continuously increase, whether it's difficult right now or it's very blissful right now. But still, you kind of have to see that you are emerging into yourself, not him or her.
All very interesting thoughts. I must say, the notion of teachers abusing people, I recognize that the crazy wisdom traditions and some of the tantric traditions and some of the Zen traditions, etc., have these long histories of weirdly abusive student-teacher
Oh yeah,
relationships
yeah.
that somehow they have thought is valuable or important. And while I get that, I must say the whole topic does make me incredibly nervous, given that the traditions that sort of have crazy wisdom as part of their aesthetic often seem to have the most scandals. It's not that it's always true, but like the sort of the farther you make that line, okay, the more
Oh,
likely people
absolutely,
are to cross over it.
absolutely.
So like
Yeah.
there's this other whole side of me that I see some of what you're saying there, and yet I have a lot of nervousness about all of that.
But maybe you have misinterpreted me. I'm not justifying the abuse at all, right? I'm actually saying quite the opposite. I'm saying that abuse, in my perspective, all abuse is coming from the unresolved ego, and the physical abuse, in my perspective, like in these traditions, hit the student with a stick, like things like that. I think this is completely, utterly inappropriate, because like from my perspective, the way that I see the aggression of the ego is a sort of a spectrum from emotional aggression towards physical aggression, right? So if you think of physical aggression helps your student, you also probably have a lot of emotional aggression, and a lot of abuse is coming from emotional aggression. So I don't think that a mature teacher is abusive, but the difference is that the mature teacher is honest. So, for example, even this question, I can give it to you, but can you take it? I'm absolutely sure that it was not issued angrily or condescendingly, or in some kind of a deliberately hurtful, painful way. But I can easily see how it can be an offensive question for a very proud person, who usually probably was, when he heard it. I mean, this is the only reason it would be offensive, right? So I'm not. So I think that any sort of deliberate abuse, or any kind of thinking that the more you hurt the ego, the sooner the realization will come, is coming from the rest of the ego of the teacher. What I'm saying is that working in the direction of honesty can oftentimes be painful. and
Oh,
and
that's definitely true.
and a good teacher, and it's usually painful, and a good teacher will help you work there, but he or she will not abuse you for their own pleasure, out of their own insecurity, basically.
God, I would hope not.
Yes. So I think we're on the same page.
Yeah, and I also think about like fundamental principles. The fundamental principles of how to look into this are like so like and the basic techniques again, so many
Oh,
really
right.
basic techniques
Yes.
just done well, taught
Yes.
well.
Yes.
I think a lot of people in these can be looking for something really elaborate or really complicated or some like with a high degree of like magical thinking, when I
Yes.
think actually most of the spiritual path is weirdly simple and people just don't want to do particularly simple things
Absolutely.
in high
Absolutely.
dose and really apply basic stuff. Like there's a book on my shelf, Mindfulness in Plain English. It, it's
Mhm.
it's a book I recommend to beginners all the time, and yet the principles of it in it well applied. Like, do you really need a whole lot more than that? Well, maybe, but like, do you necessarily need that much more than that? No. So
You don't need a lot. Yes. Yes. The
right.
path is extraordinarily simple. It's just not easy. And
Well, actually, it is for a few. I mean, I know some people it's weirdly easy for. They're just uncommon. But yes.
well, I mean, from the way that I look at it is that if the path was easy for you, it means that your ego is very, very small and you received extraordinary small amounts of mistreatment and abuse, or you haven't internalized it somehow. There were very, very little conditioning in you to begin with, because that I see as the only logical option. And another logical explanation for someone who claims the path to be easy is that they just haven't seen a lot yet, and sort of reached some level of well-being, which is demonstrably and statistically very different from the well-being of an average person, so to say, of an average dreaming person. But still, there is much more pain and suffering. Because the only other logical explanation I can see for any of the path is that you didn't have a lot of unconscious suffering to begin with.
Yeah. Sure.
Yes.
And then I hear my non-duality immediate realization friends all saying, "Yeah, yeah, yeah, but shouldn't you also mention that it's something about right here, right now, this moment, right, as it is, straightforwardly, directly, without the interface of a technique or a sense of a teacher or progression." And it's not that they're wrong;
No,
they aren't
no, they're
wrong.
not.
And so
No.
that's the other funny thing of whenever we talk about difficulties and everything, we have to figure out how to balance that weird tension between this being it, this is always where realization is found very straightforwardly, and yet some developmental process of the degree to which we can accept this in this moment. So, like, because the statement is really more like, can the teacher give you the realization, but can you handle it? It's really more that this moment is the answer. Can you
Yeah.
understand that? Right? That's even sort of the more profound thing in some way. Can you fully comprehend in some way that cuts through um, this instant? Right? Because this is always not only the method, but the punchline, as Dogen and people like that
Yes,
wisely point
I
out.
agree with that. Yes, I completely agree with that. But here's my response to that. I don't think it's very much contradictory uh,
Yeah,
because suffering also happens in the present moment,
sure.
right? The
And progression
pain,
happens in the present moment, and
yes,
realization,
exactly.
understanding. Yes, all of that.
Yes,
Definitely.
yes. So I think that the amount to which, like, can you understand that this present moment is all there is also the amount to which of uh, can you surrender and experience fully whatever is in the present moment, and that includes your suffering. So I think that this is what he meant when he said, "Can you take it?" Because in my experience, once you see, I personally don't even think that consciousness is, or awareness, or whatnot, is the destination. I kind of, the way that I look at it is that once it is found, and once the ego is disidentified with, its kind of natural job begins to explore the rejected suppressed part of the experience. That's the nature of the dark night of the soul, and the grieving, and the anger, and the tears, and all of it. So a person needs to be ready for what happens afterwards, and oftentimes, in my experience, what happens afterwards, and when I say my experience, I mean my own experience and the experience of my students too, is what happens after the realization that this is all it is, and the ego didn't exist. Uh, what happens afterwards, sometimes on the level of emotionality, energetic level, on the level of difficulty of experience, oftentimes is much more intense, right? And the whole path can be said about accepting both difficult and pleasant. I mean, pleasant and blissful are easy to accept, but both difficult and pleasant experience in their uh, fullness, in their intensity, whatever they might be.
The 10,000 joys and the 10,000 sorrows, as the
Exactly,
Zen kids say.
exactly. Yes, yes, yes.
Taoists, yeah.
Yeah, yes, yes, yes. Well, thank you. It was a very interesting discussion.
That was fun. Yeah. What else? There other questions or thoughts? There was something
Yes.
about navigating the territory.
Oh, yes. Um, yeah, it's like I also, by the way, I also agree with your notion that there are a lot of techniques that can be taught, which could be useful by self, even by people that like themselves, maybe they didn't take their techniques very far, but they can still teach you very
Hmm.
well. And another thing that I'd like to mention is that there are like levels of attainments, levels of equanimity, levels of clarity and silence in the mind, which are mapped out by different certain traditions. And it's true that the deeper your level of realization is, the more equanimous the mind is, the clearer you see the misconceptions and the struggles and the false beliefs of another mind. This is absolutely true, and it is true in my experience. So deeper
Yeah, I think that's
realizations.
true. It's way easier to see the mistakes and
Yes,
the
yes, yes,
glitches,
yes,
and
yes,
yeah, no
yes.
question.
Actually, like, even I would even say that pretty much everything on the spiritual path you kind of see in retrospect. Like, you see your prior self only very well when it's no longer present, and you see other people's misconceptions, beliefs, sufferings, self-hurting, self-limiting,
And the
self-ruling.
complexities they make out of something that, from a certain point of view, is incredibly, literally straightforward and simple, right?
Yes, 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 and absolutely, and so you see them clear. The less you have of it yourself, the clearer it is. Clear you see. So from that perspective, a deeper realized teacher is more efficient. But at the same time, what I'd like to mention is that everyone uh, can help you see something that they have seen themselves. And because the journey is so multifaceted, and the ego is so multifaceted, and there's so many issues. So a person who sort of dealt with whatever number of issues that they have dealt with on an experiential, embodied level, and is no longer struggling with it, can help your struggle when you're struggling with the same aspect of your experience. So there are all sorts of teachers that can help you in the journey, and what I oftentimes also mention is that it's entirely normal to work with one teacher for as long as it's beneficial, outgrow a teacher, look for a different teacher, look for a more realized teacher that has done struggling with what you're currently struggling with. And for as long as you remember that the role of a teacher is to increase your level of self-awareness, and that's his only role or hers, then it's all good. Then all the different teachers in all the different levels are all doing their work, are all doing their job, and they're all helping, and they're all can be useful.
And even sort of a counterpoint to something you were saying is that it's often noticed that a teacher who has more recently gone through whatever it is you were going through might be a little better for
Yes.
you at that,
Yes.
right? Than some teacher who hasn't dealt with that in like 20
Yes.
years or 30 years.
Yes.
Like, it just seems
Yes.
like
I've noticed
it
that.
can seem
Yes.
so sort of obvious or something that they may not really give it the attention or have quite the empathy because it's
This
been
is
too
very
long for
true.
them. They're too far from that particular set of challenges or struggles.
Yes.
So it is both true that people who have, various realizations could be helpful, and also people maybe just one or two steps, above you on the path might actually have a sort of a fresher empathy for those
They
particular
might be more
challenges.
relatable also to you.
Right,
Yes,
exactly.
yes,
So
yes,
so I
yes. I've
think
noticed that.
both are true.
This is very true. Yes, I haven't thought about it, but I've noticed that as my path progresses, it's sometimes it's harder to sort of relate. Uh, but like it can be a plus and a minus because oftentimes the your teacher being unaffected by it on an emotional level, but at the same time giving you very calm space to process whatever you going with can kind of intensify and exacerbate the processing. So
Yeah.
it can work both ways, but there's certainly this effect. Yes, yes, yes. Wonderful. Another question that comes up. So I think that we covered this question pretty well. Let's segue into another one. Another question that comes up oftentimes is the difference between an Arhat and the Buddha and the kind of depth of the path. And the interesting thing is, of course, for most people that are concerned with this question, it's of no real consequence.
That's true.
But nevertheless,
It's one of these, my tradition is better than your tradition because
yes,
my tradition has higher standards than yours, or whatever it is, rather than anything actually to do with their lives or their actual practice,
yes.
which is its own sort of funny game. And yeah, okay, sure. But yeah, okay, so the
We
difference. Well, the
we
first
don't
thing you
have to
have to.
discuss it, by the way.
What?
You and I,
What?
we don't have to discuss it. You and I have
No,
many
it's
other questions.
interesting. So, like, just from actually, I used to have that chapter in my book, and I actually took it out in the second edition because I found it just caused chaos and it just sort of played to people's worst tendencies. So, if you'll
Yes.
notice in the second edition of my book, that chapter is not there anymore. I wrote
Spiritual
it.
competitiveness is a very
Yeah,
big thing.
and then I took it out because I was like, oh god, this is just, I couldn't remember anything good ever coming from it. But if people were interested in the straight dogma is relatively straightforward. So
Okay, what's
even
the
in the
straight?
Theravada, Buddha is a substantially higher level than an Arhat, right? So the Buddha is an Arhat,
Yes.
you know,
I actually agree with that.
Bhagavato, Arahato, Sammasambuddhasa, who
Yes,
also has all the jhanas
yes,
necessarily, though there may be arhats with all the jhanas,
yes,
and they have all the powers. So on tap, so they can do all the powers, which arhats could also have some powers. I don't think any are actually ever reported to have all of them, except maybe Mahamoggallana. And then they also have resolved all kinds of karmic traces, and there's this funny line that's never really explained. If arhats have mastered the stages of insight, Buddhas have mastered them to the very end, and it's never really explained what that is. But you'll find that phrase in the old text if you're sort of in a Buddha over
I
arhat kind
completely
of.
agree, actually, with all of it. Funnily enough, but
Sure.
I have never read Theravada Buddhism.
And then the Buddha would have also been an arhat who practiced on the bodhisattva path for countless lifetimes, perfecting their karma and their understanding, such that they could be a wheel-turning monarch, such that they could be someone who set the wheel of the Dharma in motion in an age where it needed to be done. So that's Theravada. And then in Tibetan, there's like a whole different set of
Yeah,
complicated
yeah, yeah,
criteria and ideals of that's way too complicated to even begin to go into. But again, to whom is this going to actually apply rather than aspirationally? A very few, I would
yeah,
think.
yeah. Yes, I think that I agree, and actually, even in some other. So first of all, I am not a Buddhist, so like your knowledge of Buddhism supersedes mine like 10 times over. I haven't even read a single complete Buddhist book. I mean, it's embarrassing for me to admit, but I haven't even read your book. I'm very sorry,
That's all right.
but I mean, reading other people's books is also not how kind of evaluate people. It was enough for me to speak with you, one time, and I knew that you were real deal.
Thanks.
But basically, I think that even some of the Buddhist traditions, maybe Mahayana, I'm not an expert, they kind of subscribe to this notion of Arhat and Buddhism are the same, and the only difference is that Buddhas attained enlightenment by themselves, and Arhat did it with the help of a Buddha. So there's sort of interpretation like this. But in Theravada, I saw an important concept which I think is related to this, is about Buddha's nirvana being non-abiding. So basically, what they say, is, and I agree with that, and I saw it experientially in myself also, is that speaking of arhats and bodhisattvas, they both attained nirvana, but their nirvana is abiding. But the Buddha's nirvana is special in the way that Buddha's nirvana is non-abiding, which means that he's neither in nirvana nor in samsara. He's sort of in both, or he's in neither. And from my experience, this so since I oftentimes speak of enlightenment as the journey from the mind through the heart, so through all the emotional suppression, through all the emotional suffering that we carry from the past, back into the body. That basically the way that I saw it in my own experience, and the way that I interpreted in my experience, is that when you're in nirvana, when you're like in arhats or bodhisattvas nirvana, you often say things like, this body is not me. You're in a sort of a formless state of consciousness that kind of transcends all form, right? And Buddhas, in my experience, they transcend this state of consciousness even deeper, and come back to the body in a kind of a much more direct way. So they sort of descend from the mountain of enlightenment back to people, and when you in a way transcend consciousness and come back to the body, you sort of become indistinguishable from everyone else. It's a much deeper level of equality, and you're also back in samsara. So you're like neither in nirvana nor in samsara. You're the same as everyone else. You're the same as every squirrel. You're the same as every human. You're the same as every other life form.
Interesting. I would actually, given the description of what you just said, I would actually probably map that somewhat differently. So, like, I find anagamis have these weird things about being there and not being there and in the world, but not of the world. But, like, they get into all this sort of non-transcendent, but not transcendent, but, like, they're dealing with all that stuff. But then when the thing finally flips over and everything is just straightforwardly as it is, everything is just straightforwardly as it is, including the body. Very directly and literally, and not with this weird sense of in it, but out of it, but not in it, but out of it. So the other thing is you've got to be very careful with the definition of the word nibbana, which gets thrown around and defined a lot of different ways. But in a technical, at least Theravada sense, nibbana means two things. And one is in an Abhidhammic context, which is an old sort of technical manual of meditative states and stages and mind moments and all that. It's the momentary disappearance that happens in a cessation of fruition is the first definition.
Yeah,
And then
that's
the
not
second
the one that I use.
definition is actually the walking around living experience of an
Yes,
arhat.
that's the one. That's
So
the one that I use.
but that one actually doesn't have any of these weird dualities of in it or not in it or identified or not identified, because everything is literally just straightforwardly exactly as it is, as articulated in suttas such as the Bihya of the Bark Cloth Sutta, which is Udana 1.10, I think. And it's like in the seeing, just the seen, in the hearing, just the heard, in the thinking, just the thought, in the feeling, just the felt. Everything is just happening where it is straightforwardly, without that
Uh,
sense of reference pointiness or separateness or could be in it or out of it. It's just this. And so that just thisness all the time is definition number two of Nibbana, curiously enough.
that's
And
the one that I use.
that's the one you use.
Yes.
Interesting.
And so even in that isness, yes, so I'm not talking about a temporary experience of cessation or
Mm.
nirvana samadhi and things like that. I'm talking about nirvana as a completely completely abiding state saturating all of the daily experiences. And yet in this state, there's just this, right? There's still, and from my experience, there's still some rejection of the body and there's still some suffering. Uh, so because so in the context of mapping it, right, we if we really wanted to map it, we have to look at how if that's nirvana, and when we agree both that that's nirvana, then what is there?
We're probably going to have to fine slice that a little bit, because I would probably put that as stages of something on the way to it. If there's still an ability to reject or be in relationship to or deny, that kind of can't be it by definition, Because this is the intrinsic natural clarity of everything.
Well, in my view, if you can get angry without being hit, then you still have the ability to reject.
Oh, interesting. Okay, so you're adding on an emotional model to a physical perception or non-perception or rejection model.
Yes. So in
Some
my
people
view,
do.
the clear perception of physical reality, basically the clear perception of the five senses of the physical reality, is distorted, filtered, or veiled by the suppressed emotionality, bodily tensions, and all sorts of kind of energetic, emotional suffering, which isn't strictly speaking physical suffering, uh, as an accumulation of the past unresolved traumas. And that's also why in enlightenment, in my view, the body totally relaxes. And so, in my view, the level of relaxation of an arhat and the Buddha would be somewhat different, including the relaxation of the body. There's obviously no rejection of the present moment in arhatship. That's absurd. Absolutely, I would not contest that at all. But I think that if we wanted to map it, we probably also have to notice what do they mean then by non-abiding nirvana. So if we look at nirvana as the present of isness, right? And if that's what they talk about when they talk about arhat's nirvana, then what does it mean for it to be non-abiding? And why is the Buddha's nirvana non-abiding, whereas arhats and bodhisattvas nirvanas are abiding?
I also have not run into that particular distinction in any of the texts I've run into. So
Oh,
again, I'm yeah.
maybe this is just something that isn't a part of traditional Buddhism. I can send you a link later. Yeah,
Interesting. I may not
yeah.
just not run into it. Certainly, my study of Tibetan Buddhism is not exhaustive.
Oh, oh, okay. Yeah, well, but anyway, I think the most important point that we would agree on is that these differences aren't very important, and that the mind is only obsesses with these differences for as long as it's not sufficiently a part of the everyday conscious experience. Like for as long as this nirvana, the disidentification, the deeper acceptance of experience is not yet sufficiently apart, that's when all the stages of the path become very interesting, and they're not actually as important. It's more of an intellectual exercise for the mind and the exercise in comparisons, which the mind loves to do.
Yes.
And the mind
Rah
first does
rah rah team.
yes, and the mind first loves to do worldly comparisons, and then the spiritual path, at some point of the path, at some stage, it necessarily, like, the worldly comparisons have been transcended, but the spiritual comparisons haven't. So the same sort of suffering, the same sort of uh, 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 difficulty in experience, because all comparisons are difficult. Like whatever they arise, be it envy or pride, all of this is pain, and so they just sort of mutate into the spiritual realm.
And then it's more than that, because I think from a practice point of view, from a very practical point of view, whatever your ideals are of awakening on the path to awakening, you will attempt to imitate that.
That's right.
So
That's right.
if your model involves no emotions, you will suppress your emotions. If your model involves no pain, you will ignore pain or suppress that. If your model involves, being awake all night rather than sleeping, you will sleep less. Like you will, have lighter sleep, and uh,
Yes.
so there are all these ideals, and I've seen these countless hundreds or thousands of times in my friends and colleagues on the path. And so one just has to be very, very careful with looking at the ideals that one has adopted and noticing the near impossibility of not attempting to mimic at least some of
Yes.
those, and thus
Okay.
causing some
Yes.
kind of denial by that attempt through your
Yes.
own ideals that were supposed to help you wake up and instead helped create chaos. and denial and
Completely,
problems.
completely agree. And this applies not just to the model, but to everything else, to behavior and stuff. Like there's absolutely no reason to mimic. And even though I do say that enlightenment is, in a large sense, not completely, but in a large sense, it's transcendence of emotions, and especially a painful emotional response. But I also say all the time that there's absolutely no way that you can circumvent it, mimic it, and it happens exclusively, and the only way that it can happen is by accepting deeper and deeper whatever emotional experience you have. So the mind sort of settles down on their own. You cannot emulate it. You cannot mimic it. And the painless mind, the mind which is free from the pain from the past. I think we can define enlightenment this way: it's just the mind unburdened by the past, the mind unburdened by the pain from the past. And the painless mind is not a mind that found a trick to be painless, but it's a mind that have explored, uncovered, and surrendered to its pain to such an extraordinary degree that there's not much of it left, or none of it left from the past. I mean, it doesn't mean you won't cry in the future, but a clear mind, and the mind clear from the traumas from of the past.
Well, that's interesting. I'm gonna wax a little more human here just for fun because it'll be fun to play devil's advocate here.
Sure.
And when I read the old texts, if particularly if you read books like The Great Disciples of the Buddha, or books about the life of the Buddha, and particularly suttas like the Buddha's Last Days and things like that, you will find that the Buddha himself actually had a lot of back pain. He had a lot of headaches.
Oh, I'm not
And
talking about physical pain.
yeah. So, and these were actually attributed to stuff from his past, from his karma, from deeds and things he had done in his previous lives. So, you actually do find these things of even the Buddha himself, as advertised in the Theravada and explained, has some pain that results from the past, maybe not from necessarily from thoughts of the past. And you actually even find more interesting things. Like there's a sutta where the Buddha apparently got so irritated with his monks and nuns on their rains retreat that he left them all and went off into the forest to practice on his own, and because he was so frustrated by them. So you actually do find, at least in the Theravada and some of the original Buddhist literature, and again, there's all kinds of different ideals, you can find these examples of beings who, in theory, are quite enlightened, who actually do have some human range to them, if you will.
you know, uh, when you say human range, you mean the range of suffering, right? Because like I don't like when people use the word human to mean suffering. I don't really.
Okay, sure. I hear the problem with it, but
Yeah.
you see what I mean. Some
Yes.
what most people would think of as an ordinary human range,
Yes.
I should say.
Okay. 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 I see. I see.
And
Okay.
I've hung out with a reasonable number of people who have said that they were free from all emotions or all negative emotions. It's the curious friend circles I run in. This is not that infrequent to claim. And it's interesting, if you get to hang out with anybody like that for long enough, you will get to see what's the word? Moments of ordinary humanity in some more grounded, down to earth way, if you get to watch what happens in moments of greater challenge. Now, that doesn't mean there can't be some amazing things. So, for example, I have an interview with my late friend Richard that you can see, and he's talking about like the extraordinary suffering he went through at the end of his life, and yet this sort of meta perspective on it that came from extraordinarily deep practice that was fine, very deeply fine. At the same time, there was a lot of end of life, not goodness going on. And it's a nice interview. I recommend checking it out. You can find it on my Vimeo channel. And this is another practitioner facing the end of life who was a very deep practitioner with a lot of wisdom. And it's he does a nice job of dancing around the mix of the consequences of being born and very deep practice.
Okay. Yes. I listened to it very carefully. I would like to address it. Well. First of all, I'm not talking about physical pain, right? So physical pain, end of life. Like I would never claim myself personally that I have transcended physical pain, or like that I don't mind physical pain. I actually claim the opposite. I claim what very few people claim. I claim that it's impossible for me to experience emotional pain, but I absolutely hate physical pain. No, no, no. Thank you, thank you, thank you. I would take. I'm actually, like, from my perspective, I'm much more human than those people who say, There is no pain, there is no body, pain doesn't exist, but still can get angry, like for example. So I would probably, if I were in a very deep physical pain, I wouldn't be quantumous at all. I would be screaming and shouting and absolutely, right. So like, in my view, in the way that I see the reality, the physical is way more fundamental than emotional. Like the emotional and mental are nothing compared to the physical. And from my perspective, the physical cannot be transcended until you die at all. But the emotional and mental can. And so I'm not talking about physical pain, struggling with back pain, struggling with end of life. Again, not as much emotionally as in I'm not going to get to do stuff here anymore. I will have to say goodbye to all of this. In my experience, it's a part of the enlightenment process. Uh, like maybe there's some deeper depth to it as the end of life approaches, but from the physical perspective, of course, it can be very challenging. Maybe it's going to be extraordinarily painful. Maybe the process of death itself is going to be extraordinarily painful. We don't know. There's no one to talk about it, right? So if you came back to talk about it, then you haven't died yet, obviously. So maybe something that happens as the body begins to decompose and die is actually also physically very much painful. I don't know. I would never make any claims about physical pain. Now, from the perspective of being irritated, needing to practice, or having headaches, this is something that I would take issue with because, based on what you're saying, I would not even classify Gautama as fully enlightened if it's true what you're saying, which would also make sense from the perspective that he prophesied an arrival of Maitreya. And I don't believe in any sorts of prophecies and ability to see the future and stuff like that. And in my perspective, if he did that, it means that he just intuited that a much kind of truer natural state of being is just a state of being of equality, because Maitreya means friend, not a lord, not a Buddha. And in my perspective, equality isn't possible before we come back to our bodies. Now, with regards to headaches, very important. This is actually has been mentioned by many people, that, like, sages had headaches and stuff like that. So I myself used to be a sufferer from migraines. So I used to have a migraine every
Mm.
month, or sometimes twice a month. My migraines were extreme, meaning that it was such an excruciating pain that I would not be able to move. I would not, the lights would bother me, sounds would bother me. I would throw up every time.
Mm.
Sometimes, like, multiple times on an empty stomach, like there's nothing in my stomach. I would drink a little and I would throw up all the time. That was my
Mm.
usual routine before enlightenment. Now, then, after enlightenment, they still came back uh, after some time, like maybe after half a year or so. They still came back, but over the last like 5 or 7 years, it's been less and less. They come back less and less.
Good.
And as I continued to use psychedelics, actually, it was very obvious what is going on. So every time that they would come back, they would be much less severe than maybe a year or two ago. Out of this migraines, I would just get headaches. About half a year ago or 2 years ago, the worst. Oh, sorry, half to 1 year ago, they basically became. I could have a slight headache in the morning, but I take a walk, and half an hour afterwards the headache is gone. And it was extraordinarily obvious for me that these migraines, these headaches, they have to do with the traumas of the past. They have to do with the resistance of the experience, because they would come back with elevated mind activity. And my wife is going through something like this
Mm.
right now. So they would come back with elevated mind activity. They would come back with some sort of misery. There would be a component to them, which is like, why am I going through this? I really don't want to experience this. There's too much pain. Oh, please, when will this end? And this component would slowly diminish, and diminish. And now, even if I have so there would be a deep correlation between the intensity of a migraine and this mind component of rejection of the experience of a migraine. And and coupled with the fact that, as we both know, you much better than me, that there are no, like, nerve endings in the brain, and actually the pain in the brain is of a very different uh, nature than the physical pain. Like when you cut your finger, in my experience, I'm firmly convinced that migraines and headache, well, unless maybe they were induced by hitting you, but sort of the migraines are very much tensions and unprocessed trauma, still tensions from the past. They're very much mind tensions. So the mind sort of creates the perception of pain, but it's very much mind tensions, and they do disappear. And in my experience, it was very obvious that they continue to disappear. So I just wanted to mention to mention those two things.
Interesting. And then you mentioned that like it hadn't caused transcendence or change in the relationship to pain at all, whereas actually my
Uh,
experience is a little
well,
bit
I would say at all. I
okay.
would
Well, okay.
uh, like
Whereas my experience is somewhat different because the lack of like the directness with which pain is perceived, like it's no bigger than it actually is and no more there than when it's actually there. And there, since it's vibratory, it's actually only there part of the time, right? And so, not that there isn't a high degree of clarity about what pain is there, but there's also the proportionality that the vast majority of experience, even when something hurts, is actually okay. So
But yes, of course.
so there
But
is
it
this
doesn't mean
funny
that you don't.
thing with the clarity and the perception, the proportionality, that in some ways pain is worse because it's clearer, and in some ways it's vastly better because all the stuff that is not hurting is also clear.
That's
And
right.
so
Yes.
that's a funny thing
Yeah.
when you want to talk about like, is pain different?
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Something in the
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
relationship
Yeah.
to it
Yeah.
is
We,
actually really
we
different.
don't we don't disagree on that. Like when you say that it's not no more than it is. So
Right.
you basically referring the mind's tendency to make everything more than it is,
Yeah, the
and
second arrow, as we would say in Buddhism, not, yeah.
yes, yes. So it's the same. Like it jives very well with what I said. Like the amount of pain in my head as a migraine would be
Mm.
proportional to the level of rejection. Of just saying, well, when will it end, and things like that. So the mental, the rejection from the mind. So it's the mind that makes the pain more than it is, and also of course there is a much higher level of acceptance of pain, and especially of chronic pain. Because first of all, it's not more than it is, as you said, and secondly, there's nothing you can do about it. So like for example, I have an injured shoulder.
Mm.
So when I fall asleep, sometimes it hurts, and basically I am just directing it automatically goes there, like my awareness automatically goes into where it hurts, and I don't mind it at all. I actually sometimes can even experience deep pleasure from it. But I was basically just challenging the notion that a completely enlightened human would not mind pain at all. Like if you cut off my arm, I will scream for sure. I mean, it's
If you
one
didn't
thing.
pass out, but yes.
Yes, yes. So it's one thing to sort of slowly relax into chronic pain, which is there and you cannot do anything about it, right? It's another thing to say, uh, I completely transcended physical pain. So it would not. Oftentimes in spirituality, uh, I pay like I point people to how the words don't match what can be observed, right? So if you say, like, for example, uh, I completely transcend physical pain, but if you still scream, uh, you can say it's not me, consciousness, like blah 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 blah. But what's the point? I mean, from my perspective, words should match behavior, right? So if you say you completely transcended suffering, but you get angry or cry at things that not out of sadness and or compassion, but out of your own discontent, out of your own pain, uh, then obviously it's not true. So I'm very, very skeptical. People who say I transcended physical body. Well, I said to them, well, why do you eat? You behave like you didn't transcend the physical body. You take an apple and you eat it, and then you go poop. What's the point of so me myself, I certainly did not transcend physical body. I am my physical body. I just only transcended the mind. And from my perspective, all of the states, and including the formless states that can be created in the mind, are sort of what can be transcended, but the physical body actually cannot. That's my perspective.
Interesting. Yeah. And again, part of this, like having hung out and had these conversations enough times, enough ways with enough people, one of the things I realize is that there very well may be variance. The lumper in me does not like this notion of variance and diverse endpoints. And yet the phenomenologist in me recognizes that there is this range of people describing things that seem actually in some ways kind of different functionally, experientially, etc., with some common themes of directness and immediacy and all of those kinds of things,
Yeah.
but also uh, with some things that, like, if they're being straightforward and honest and they're just describing their experience, there may be some variance. And then it's tempting to then put those on some sort of a hierarchy, interesting, or maybe just to look out there as variant. And then the other question is, if you're a practitioner watching this, how might that apply to you? Because the question then is, are all variants open to you? And I'm not necessarily sure that might be true, because people sort of end up in places that like are not entirely unpredictable given kind of who they were and what they optimized for and kind of how their personality style was sometimes. So I actually wonder if all variants are something you could choose and it's just a question of technique or tradition or the best teacher, or is it the other possibility is that when people arrive at wherever they're arriving, that was where they were going to end up if they took it far enough. And maybe not all possibilities are necessarily something that they could have gotten. I think this is an open question that is worthy of some discussion and some study, though I don't know how you would do the experiment two different ways. Like take a person and they could either do this and end up here or do this and end up there. Like it's very hard to know what how you do actually do real hypothesis testing on that. So it may just be an open question.
Yes, this actually. I mean, I don't know if we're running out of time, but this actually.
We are. I've got 2
Oh,
minutes.
okay, yes. Oh, okay. So, but this, one of my students also asked a question if we think that different paths lead to different destinations or the same. So I tend to think the same. So I tend to look at all these variances as stages of the path. But you might be right. Maybe there are some variances.
Well, I've just had enough of these conversations with enough people, because when you make a claim like I do or like you do, you know, it's not uncommon for other people who make similar claims to want to discuss, compare,
But
contrast.
from my perspective, it's very easy to test it. I mean, my perspective is that
Maybe.
is that you give a person 10 tabs of LSD and see what happens.
Well, see, that's an interesting thing, because I was actually about to say I'm a total psychedelic lightweight, whisper doses, and I'm. Does that like? So I'm weirdly sensitive to these things.
So I
What
was
does that
too.
mean?
I
I
mean,
wonder.
okay, again, I can only speak from my own experience, but I was too. I was absolutely like for the first like 2 or 3 years after the self-realization, even a very small amount of psychedelic would be very like lots of stuff. So maybe it's a personal thing, or maybe it just means that there's more unconscious suffering and there's more integration to go through. It's possible. It's possible both ways. But my story with psychedelics was normal, then enlightenment, extraordinary sensitive, very painful, lots, then less sensitive, less sensitive. Like slowly over the years, it sort of goes down and down and down.
All right, cool. I gotta go. This has been absolutely
Thank you,
delightful. It's
Daniel. It
fun
was
chatting.
wonderful.
It's interesting to share the journey and share the
It was
stories
it was
and
very interesting.
try to land some clarity. And if you're watching this, be lights unto yourselves. Simple
Yes,
practices.
yes,
This body, answers found here somehow. Yeah. Anyway, cool.
yes. Thank you, Daniel.
Been
Thank you very
delightful.
much. It was a big pleasure. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.